It's one of the biggest mysteries in all of economics. Why do our modern economies swing back and forth between these incredible booms and these really painful busts? For pretty much all of human history, the cause of a downturn was, well, it was obvious. A bad harvest, a war, maybe a plague. But today, the reasons are a whole lot murkier. So let's put on our detective hats and dive into the clues to figure out what really causes a modern recession.
So let's start with a question that probably seems obvious. If our technology gets better, right, if we invent faster computers, more efficient machines, shouldn't that make all of us more productive? And you'd think if we're all more productive, then we should all be working more and creating more wealth. I mean, it just seems like basic logic. But as we're about to find out, the real answer is surprisingly complicated.
All right, so our first suspect in this whole mystery is a really powerful idea called real business cycle theory. For a long time, this was the leading explanation, and it offers a very direct and frankly a very compelling story for why economies go up and down. Okay, so at its heart, real business cycle theory, or RBC for short, says that booms and busts aren't a sign that the market has failed. Not at all. Instead, they're the economy's natural and even efficient way of responding to what it calls real shocks. And we're not talking about things like the money supply here. We're talking about tangible stuff. And the most important real shock of all is a change in technology. The whole theory really just boils down to two big ideas. First, real shocks are the engine that drives the whole business cycle. Things like new inventions, or even negative shocks like a sudden spike in oil prices. And second, people react to these shocks in a totally rational way. We aren't just passive victims, we actually make choices. To really get what they're talking about, let's use an example from the source material. Just imagine a bad harvest, say 20,000 years ago. Well, that's a negative real shock. The technology of farming has kind of failed for a season. The economy can't produce as much food, and so people are poorer. This is basically RBC theory in a nutshell. And honestly, it's a fantastic explanation for about 99% of all the business cycles in human history. So here's the wild part. What this means is that, from this point of view, a recession is actually a collective, rational choice. When our productivity is temporarily low because of a negative shock, it actually makes perfect sense for people to say, you know what, I'm going to work a little less and take some more time off. So the recession isn't a sign of a broken economy. It's the sign of a smart economy making the best out of a bad situation. Okay, so this theory sounds pretty neat, right? It's elegant, it's powerful, but like any good theory, it has to make specific predictions that we can actually test. And this is where our detective story takes a really interesting turn. The prediction that comes right out of RBC theory is super simple. If we get a positive technology shock, let's say some new software comes out that makes everyone way more efficient, then our labor suddenly becomes more valuable. So the rational thing to do should be to work more hours to cash in on this new productivity. We should see hours worked and productivity go up together. Makes sense, right? But here is the major plot twist. When economists actually looked at the real-world data, this is what they found. What you're seeing here are charts that plot changes in productivity against changes in the number of hours people worked. According to the theory, we should see a nice, clean, upward-sloping line. More productivity, more hours. But instead, it's just a messy clot of dots. The correlation is basically zero. The data just flat out doesn't match the theory's clean prediction. So this puzzle, this productivity hours anomaly, as it's called, it really cracked the door open for a rival theory, a totally different explanation for what might be going on under the hood of our economy. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because this challenger, the sticky price model, it makes a prediction that is the absolute polar opposite of RBC theory. It says that a good technology shock should actually lead to fewer hours worked, at least in the short run. So how on earth could that be true? Okay, the whole thing hinges on this one concept. Prices are sticky. They don't just change instantly. So imagine a company gets some new tech that lets it make all its stuff with half the workers. Well, because prices all across the economy haven't had time to adjust yet, the overall demand for that company's product is still the same. So what does the company do? It does the logical thing. It keeps producing the same amount to meet that same demand. But now it only needs half the labor to do it. So now we've got two suspects with completely different alibis. RBC theory says better tech means more work. The sticky price model says better tech means less work. To figure out who's telling the truth, we've got to go back to the evidence and test these claims by slicing up the data in a very, very clever way. So here's the brilliant move pioneered by the economist Jordi Gali. What if we could statistically pull apart the economic data? What if we could isolate the changes in productivity and hours that are caused only by pure technology shocks and separate them from everything else? Things like monetary policy or just general shifts in demand. And bingo, this is what they found. Let's look at the two graphs that are highlighted. The one in the middle shows what happens when a technology shock hits. And you can see it, a clear downward slope, a negative correlation. Higher productivity is linked with fewer hours worked. But now look at the bottom graph. For every other kind of non-technology shock, the correlation is positive. This is exactly what the sticky price model predicted would happen. And if you're not convinced yet, here is the smoking gun. These charts show us how the economy reacts over time right after a shock. I want you to focus on that chart in the bottom left corner. It tracks what happens to hours right after a positive technology shock hits. See how that line immediately dips below zero and then stays there for a while? This is really powerful proof that new technology can actually lead to a drop in employment, at least in the short term. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. What we have here are two completely, fundamentally different ways of looking at an economic downturn. So let's just lay it all out side by side. In the RBC world, a recession is a rational choice we all make because of a real negative shock, like bad technology. But in the sticky price world, a recession is much more likely caused by a shock to demand, which leads to people losing their jobs involuntarily, all because prices and wages just can't adjust fast enough. And if you need one last piece of proof, look at this. The gray bars you see on these charts, those are actual historical recessions. Now check out the top graph. This shows the economic cycles caused only by technology shocks. You can see they don't line up with the recessions very well at all. But now look at the bottom graph, the one showing cycles from non-technology shocks. It's a nearly perfect match for the business cycles we've all actually lived through.
Okay, we've followed the clues, we've looked at the evidence. So what's the final verdict in our little economic detective story?
So what have we learned from all this? Well, while RBC theory is a really powerful way to look at most of economic history, the evidence from our modern world tells a different story about our short-term ups and downs. It really looks like technology shocks, even though they're crucial for our long-term growth, can actually reduce jobs in the short run. And the cycles that we call recessions seem to be driven more by things like demand, all happening in a world where prices are, well, sticky. And that leaves us with one last big provocative thought. We know for a fact that technology is the engine of our prosperity in the long run. But if it isn't the main thing driving our short-term booms, then what is? And what does that mean for how we should be trying to manage our economy? It looks like this investigation is far from over.